Between 1847 and 1849, 17 members of the Fairchild family died across 3 Louisiana parishes under circumstances that baffled every physician who examined them. The symptoms were identical: violent tremors, blackened tongues, and a peculiar sweet smell that clung to their bed sheets for weeks after burial. Local authorities attributed the deaths to a mysterious fever, but Dr. Benjamin Cartwright of New Orleans wrote in his personal journal that the pattern defied every known disease. What terrified him most was a detail he never published. In each household, the family cook had disappeared exactly 3 days before the first symptom appeared. The Louisiana Territory Medical Board sealed Cartwright's findings in 1851, and they remained hidden in the New Orleans Public Library archives until a fire destroyed them in 1923. Before we continue with the story of the Fairchild plantation and the woman who brought an empire to its knees, I need you to do something. If you find yourself captivated by stories of forgotten American mysteries, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss our investigations into the darkest corners of history. Also, leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We love knowing where our audience connects with these tales. Now, let's discover what really happened on the banks of Bayou. The truth behind those 17 deaths would not emerge until decades later, when an elderly woman named Celia made a confession on her deathbed in a Baton Rouge poorhouse, speaking words that would finally explain the dynasty's collapse. The Fairchild plantation sprawled across 1,200 acres along the western banks of Bayou Teche in St. Martin Parish, Louisiana. Established in 1809 by Colonel Richard Fairchild, a veteran of the Revolutionary War who had received the land as a military grant, the estate had grown into one of the most profitable sugar operations in the South. By 1847, the Fairchild name carried weight not just in Louisiana, but throughout the cotton and sugar markets of New Orleans, Memphis, and even as far north as Philadelphia. The main house stood 3 stories tall, built in the Greek Revival style that had become fashionable among wealthy planters. White columns supported a broad gallery that wrapped around the second floor, offering views of the cane fields that stretched toward the horizon like a green ocean. Inside, imported French wallpaper covered the walls, and crystal chandeliers from Boston hung in the dining room and ballroom. The Fairchilds entertained frequently, hosting other plantation families, merchants from New Orleans, and occasionally politicians who came seeking support and donations. By the late 1840s, the family had splintered into 3 branches, each controlling a separate plantation. The original Fairchild estate remained under the control of Thomas Fairchild, Colonel Richard's grandson, a stern man of 43, who had inherited his grandfather's business acumen, but none of his military bearing. Thomas ran his plantation with mechanical efficiency, keeping meticulous records of every bushel of sugar produced, every slave purchased, every penny spent on equipment or seed. His brother, William Fairchild, managed a smaller operation 15 miles south near the town of New Iberia. William had a reputation for volatility, settling disputes with his fists and maintaining order through fear rather than the cold calculation his brother preferred. Where Thomas kept detailed ledgers, William kept a whip within arm's reach and made examples of those who displeased him. The 3rd branch belonged to their cousin, Margaret Fairchild Rousseau, who had married into another prominent planting family. Her estate lay north of the original Fairchild land, closer to the town of Breaux Bridge. Margaret had inherited her portion of the family holdings after her father's death in 1843, and managed her property with a businesswoman's sharp eye, unusual for the time, but not unheard of among Louisiana's Creole-influenced society. All 3 estates relied on the labor of enslaved people, numbering nearly 400 souls across the 3 properties. They worked the cane fields from before dawn until after dusk during harvest season, their lives governed by the brutal rhythms of sugar production. The Fairchilds prided themselves on running what they called well-ordered operations, though what they meant by order would have been called tyranny in any honest assessment. Among those 400 enslaved people was a woman named Celia, approximately 30 years old in 1847. Though no precise record of her birth existed, she had been born on the original Fairchild plantation, the daughter of a woman named Ruth, who had worked in the main house as a seamstress. Celia showed intelligence from an early age, learning to read despite laws forbidding it. Taught secretly by Ruth using scraps of newspaper and pages torn from discarded books. When Celia was 14, Thomas Fairchild's wife, Elizabeth, noticed her aptitude and brought her into the main house to train as a cook. Elizabeth Fairchild was a Baltimore native who brought northern sensibilities to Louisiana, though not enough to question the fundamental injustice of the system she had married into. She appreciated fine food and recognized that Celia had a gift for combining flavors, for understanding how heat and time transformed ingredients. Over the next 16 years, Celia became the most valued cook in St. Martin Parish. She prepared elaborate French-influenced meals for the Fairchilds' dinner parties, mastered the art of preserving vegetables for winter, and created desserts that visiting guests praised effusively. Her reputation extended beyond the Fairchild estate. William Fairchild frequently borrowed Celia's services for his own entertainments, and Margaret Russo had offered to purchase her outright on 3 separate occasions, offers that Thomas Fairchild refused. But Celia's value came with a price. She had access to the main house, to the family's private spaces, to their conversations and secrets. She heard Thomas Fairchild discuss the sale of Sarah, a young woman who'd been Celia's childhood friend, to a plantation in Mississippi, separating her from her children without a moment's hesitation. She overheard William Fairchild boast about the punishment he had administered to a man named Joseph for the crime of learning to write. She saw Margaret Russo calculate profit margins while families were torn apart to balance her ledgers. More significantly, Celia had access to the plantation's stillroom, a small building behind the main house where medicines were prepared, where herbs hung drying from the rafters, and where the household's medical supplies were kept. Elizabeth Fairchild, who fancied herself knowledgeable about home remedies, maintained an extensive collection of substances, both healing and harmful. Willordum for pain, calomel for purging, ipecac for inducing vomiting, digitalis extracted from foxglove for heart conditions, and numerous other preparations common to 19th century medical practice. What Elizabeth did not know was that Celia had spent years studying these substances, learning their properties not from medical texts, but from careful observation and from knowledge passed down from older enslaved people who remembered African practices of healing and harm. She knew which plants growing wild along the bayou could cure fever and which could cause it. She understood dosages, timing, and the crucial importance of consistency. She also knew that suspicion would fall on her immediately if anything obvious happened. So she waited and she watched and she planned with a patience that came from living a life where patience was the only form of power available. The event that finally pushed Celia from observation to action occurred on a humid evening in early May of 1847. Thomas Fairchild had purchased a 12-year-old boy named Samuel from a trader passing through New Iberia. Samuel's mother, a woman named Anna, who worked in the Fairchild laundry, had not seen her son in 3 years, not since he had been sold away as a child. By chance, by the cruel mathematics of the slave trade, he had been brought back to the same parish where his mother still lived. Anna had begged Thomas Fairchild to purchase her son, had offered to work additional hours to take on any task, to do anything required. Fairchild had bought Samuel, not out of mercy, but because he needed another field hand, and the price was fair. For 3 weeks, Anna believed her prayers had been answered. She was allowed to see Samuel each evening after the work was done, to feed him, to tell him she had never stopped searching for him. Then William Fairchild visited his brother's estate to examine the new purchases, and he decided he wanted Samuel for his own operation. The boy was strong for his age, William observed, and would be useful in the harder labor required on his less mechanized plantation. Thomas agreed to the sale immediately. It was business, nothing more. Anna's screams when they took Samuel away could be heard across the entire plantation. She collapsed in the yard, clawing at the dirt, begging them to kill her instead. Thomas Fairchild ordered her locked in one of the slave quarters until she regained her composure, which he expected would take a day or two at most. Celia helped carry Anna to the quarters. She sat with her through the night while Anna wept, while she called out her son's name, while she eventually fell into an exhausted silence that was somehow worse than the screaming. Just before dawn, Anna looked at Celia with eyes that held nothing but emptiness and said 5 words, "There is no God here." Anna died 2 days later. The plantation physician, Dr. LeBlanc from New Iberia, attributed her death to heart failure brought on by excessive distress. He made this diagnosis without examining the body closely, signing the death certificate while standing in the doorway of the quarters, unwilling to enter the cramped, stifling space where Anna lay. Celia prepared Anna's body for burial, washing her and wrapping her in clean cloth. As she worked, she thought about the still room behind the main house, about the substances that Elizabeth Fairchild kept locked in a cabinet, but whose key hung on a hook that Celia knew the location of. She thought about Mary, her own daughter, 8 years old, who Thomas Fairchild had recently mentioned might be suitable for training as a house servant once she was a bit older. She thought about the 15 years she had spent perfecting recipes designed to please people who considered her property. That night, Celia made her decision. She would not run. Running meant abandoning her daughter, meant risking the dogs and the hunters and the advertisements that would be placed in the New Orleans newspapers. Running meant failure almost certainly, and even success meant living in fear forever. Instead, she would stay. She would cook, and she would begin to add something extra to the Fairchild family meals. Something that would work slowly enough to avoid suspicion, that would seem like natural illness, that would allow her to move between the 3 estates, as she had always done. Her presence so ordinary that no one would think to question it. She would give them sweetness and death in equal measure, and she would watch them wonder why God had abandoned them. The first symptoms appeared on May 23, 1847, 3 weeks after Anna's burial. Elizabeth Fairchild complained of tremors in her hands during breakfast, a minor shake that caused her to set down her coffee cup more carefully than usual. Thomas Fairchild attributed it to nerves, perhaps exhaustion from the previous week's entertaining, when they had hosted a dinner party for 12 guests from New Orleans. Celia had prepared that dinner, a 7-course meal that had drawn compliments throughout the evening. The main course had been a duck confit with preserved cherries, a recipe Elizabeth particularly loved, one that Celia had perfected over years of refinement. She had served it herself, making sure each portion was properly arranged, making sure the sauce had exactly the right consistency. What no one at that dinner table could have known was that the preserved cherries contained something extra, something Celia had extracted through a careful process from the pits of wild cherries that grew along the bayou. The substance was prick acid, though Celia would not have known it by that name. She knew only that cherry pits, when prepared in a specific way her mother had shown her years ago and warned her never to use, produced a powder that in very small amounts could be added to food without detection. The dosage was crucial. Too much and the effect would be immediate and obvious, but tiny amounts delivered consistently over time would accumulate in the body slowly. The symptoms would seem like a mysterious illness, something that progressed gradually. That baffled physicians who looked for single causes rather than steady poisoning. Elizabeth's tremors worsened over the next week. By early June, she had difficulty holding a pen steady enough to write letters. Her handwriting, previously elegant and precise, became shaky and irregular. Dr. LeBlanc examined her and prescribed rest along with laudanum for her nerves. He suggested she might be suffering from a nervous condition, perhaps brought on by the stress of managing a large household. Thomas Fairchild accepted this diagnosis, though he worried about his wife's condition. He instructed Celia to prepare lighter meals, broths, and easily digestible foods to help Elizabeth recover her strength. Celia complied, preparing chicken soup with herbs, beef broth with vegetables, all of it carefully made, all of it containing tiny additional ingredients that ensured Elizabeth's condition would not improve. By mid-June, Elizabeth had developed a new symptom, a blackening of her tongue that Dr. Leblanc could not explain. It resembled the discoloration that sometimes accompanied certain fevers, but Elizabeth had no fever. Her temperature remained normal even as her tremors increased and her tongue darkened. Leblanc consulted his medical texts, wrote letters to colleagues in New Orleans, and found no satisfactory explanation. Celia continued her work, preparing 3 meals a day for the family, baking bread, preserving vegetables, performing all the tasks expected of her. She maintained her usual demeanor, efficient and quiet, showing appropriate concern when asked about the mistress's health. No one suspected her because no one imagined she could be responsible. She was Celia the cook, a fixture of the household who had been there for 16 years. What made her method particularly effective was that she varied her delivery. Sometimes she would prepare a meal for the entire family that contained her additions. Other times she would serve everyone clean food, but add something extra to Elizabeth's plate specifically, disguising it in sauces or gravies, where any slight bitterness would be overwhelmed by other flavors. She used the storeroom supplies cleverly, taking tiny amounts that would not be missed, replacing them with similar-looking substances so that Elizabeth's collection appeared untouched. Elizabeth Fairchild died on July 2, 1847, 40 days after her symptoms first appeared. The death certificate listed the cause as nervous fever with complications, a vague diagnosis that meant doctor. Leblanc had no idea what had actually killed her. The funeral was well attended with families from throughout the parish coming to pay respects to Thomas Fairchild and his 2 young sons. Celia helped prepare the funeral meal, as she had helped prepare hundreds of meals before it. She made baked ham with honey glaze, cornbread, green beans cooked with bacon, 3 different pies. The guests praised the food as they always did, commenting that the Fairchild plantation would not be the same without Elizabeth's refined tastes and Celia's expert preparation. Thomas Fairchild grieved as much as a man of his temperament could grieve. He had been fond of Elizabeth in his way, though his fondness had always been secondary to his business interests. Within a month, he began discussing with his brother and cousin the possibility of remarrying, as running a plantation household required a woman's oversight, or so conventional wisdom insisted. What Thomas and William and Margaret Fairchild did not know was that Elizabeth's death was only the beginning. Celia had started with the mistress because Elizabeth's death would seem most natural, most attributable to the vague nervous conditions that physicians blamed for numerous female ailments in that era. But her actual target was larger, more comprehensive. She intended to end the entire Fairchild dynasty, every member of the family who owned human beings, who calculated profit in terms of other people's suffering. She would do it slowly, carefully, moving between the 3 estates as she had always done, her presence so normal that no one would ever think to connect the dots between her visits and the illnesses that followed. In August of 1847, Thomas Fairchild asked Celia to help at his brother William's plantation during a dinner party William was hosting. This was a common request. Celia had cooked at William's estate dozens of times over the years, had become familiar with his kitchen, his supplies, his routines. She agreed immediately, as she always did, because refusing would have invited questions. She traveled the 15 miles to William's plantation in a wagon driven by Daniel, an elderly enslaved man who managed transportation between the estates. The journey took most of a day along rough roads that wound through cane fields and cypress swamps. They arrived in the late afternoon, and Celia immediately began preparing for the evening's meal. William Fairchild was hosting 6 other planters and their wives. a business dinner meant to discuss sugar prices and shipping arrangements for the upcoming harvest. Celia prepared roasted pork with apple chutney, rice with herbs, squash cooked in butter, and a molasses cake for dessert. The apple chutney was particularly well received, its sweetness balanced by a tang that the guests found refreshing in the humid Louisiana summer. What they could not taste, what they could never have detected, was the powder Celia had derived from oleander leaves that grew wild throughout the parish. Oleander was beautiful and deadly, producing white or pink flowers that people planted decoratively without understanding their toxicity. Celia had learned about oleander from an older woman named Ruth, the same Ruth who had taught her to read, who had told her stories about plants that looked harmless, but could stop a heart or paralyze muscles when prepared correctly. The symptoms from oleander poisoning were similar to those produced by cherry pit poison: tremors, confusion, irregular heartbeat, eventually death. But Onda worked differently, affected different systems in the body. By varying her methods, Celia created a pattern that looked like an epidemic of mysterious fever rather than deliberate poisoning. This strategy would prove brilliant in its simplicity. When multiple people fell ill with similar but not identical symptoms, physicians would look for a common disease, a contaminated water source, perhaps a miasma in the air. They would never imagine that someone was moving between households, carefully distributing death in precisely measured doses. But that level of sophistication came with a challenge. Celia needed to be patient. She needed to wait for symptoms to develop, to allow time to pass between incidents, to make everything seem natural and unconnected. This meant she would be living among the Fairchilds for months or potentially years, watching them slowly die, maintaining her role as the trusted cook who had served the family for nearly 2 decades. It meant she would need to be perfect in her deception, never showing hesitation, never revealing the satisfaction she felt each time she heard that another Fairchild was experiencing tremors or blackening of the tongue. It meant she was committing herself to a course of action that had no way back, that would end either in the complete destruction of the Fairchild family or in her own exposure and execution. On the wagon ride back to the main plantation, Daniel commented that Celia seemed quieter than usual. She told him she was tired from the long day of cooking, which was true enough. What she did not tell him was that she was thinking about William Fairchild's face as he ate the apple chutney she had prepared, how he had called for a second serving, how he had praised her skill in front of his guests. She was thinking about Anna and about Mary and about the 400 souls who work these plantations without choice or hope. She was thinking that perhaps, just perhaps, she could do something that mattered, something that would reduce the suffering, even if only by removing 3 families from the ranks of those who caused it. She was thinking that she had become something new, something that did not fit into the categories the Fairchilds used to organize their world. She was no longer just Celia, the cook, the enslaved woman who prepared meals and kept quiet. She had become a force moving through their lives, invisible and patient, carrying death in her careful hands. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it gave her the first sense of power she had felt in 30 years of living as someone else's property. By September of 1847, William Fairchild began experiencing symptoms identical to those that had killed his sister-in-law. The tremors started in his hands, making it difficult for him to write or hold objects steadily. His overseer, a man named Patterson from Virginia, noticed that William had trouble gripping his walking stick during inspections of the fields, that he occasionally stumbled for no apparent reason. William consulted Dr. LeBlanc, who had treated Elizabeth Fairchild during her final illness. LeBlanc was disturbed by the similarity of symptoms, but could find no logical connection between the 2 cases. William had not been present at his brother's estate during Elizabeth's illness. There was no obvious way for him to have contracted the same mysterious fever, if indeed it was a fever at all. The doctor prescribed rest and a tonic he prepared himself, a mixture of iron supplements and herbs meant to strengthen the blood. William took the tonic faithfully 3 times a day and noticed no improvement. The tremors worsened, His tongue began to darken. He developed difficulty sleeping, lying awake at night while his heart raced irregularly in his chest. Thomas Fairchild visited his brother in October and was shocked by William's deterioration. In less than 2 months, William had lost significant weight. His face had taken on a gray pallor, and his eyes had developed a wild, frightened look. Thomas insisted on bringing a second physician from New Orleans, Dr. Benjamin Cartwright, whose reputation as a diagnostician was known throughout Louisiana. Dr. Cartwright arrived in late October and spent 3 days examining William Fairchild, reviewing Dr. LeBlanc's notes and interviewing everyone in the household about William's routines and habits. Cartwright was a methodical man educated at the University of Pennsylvania, who approached medicine with scientific rigor unusual for the time. He noticed several things that disturbed him. First, the progression of William's illness precisely mirrored that of Elizabeth Fairchild, following the same timeline from initial tremors to tongue discoloration to cardiac irregularity. Second, there was a peculiar sweet smell in William's bedroom, faint but detectable, that Cartwright could not identify. Third, when he interviewed the household staff, he learned that Celia, the cook from Thomas Fairchild's estate, had prepared a meal at William's plantation in August, shortly before William's symptoms began. Cartwright made notes of these observations in his journal, but did not yet draw any conclusions. Medical science in 1847 lacked the tools to detect poisoning except in the most obvious cases. There were no blood tests, no chemical analyses that could reveal the presence of plant toxins. Physicians relied on symptoms, on their experience, and on their instincts. What Cartwright's instincts told him was that something was very wrong, that the pattern of illness in the Fairchild family was not natural, but instinct was not proof, and making an accusation without proof, especially an accusation that would implicate an enslaved woman and potentially throw suspicion on one of Louisiana's prominent families, would have been professionally and socially ruinous. So Cartwright kept his suspicions to himself, wrote carefully neutral notes in his journal, and prescribed the same useless treatments that Dr. LeBlanc had tried. He told Thomas Fairchild that his brother was suffering from a severe nervous disorder, possibly related to the strain of managing a plantation, possibly hereditary. He recommended rest, fresh air, and a bland diet. William Fairchild died on November 8, 1847. He was 40 years old. The death certificate listed the cause as nervous fever with cardiac complications, the same diagnosis that had been given for Elizabeth. Dr. Cartwright attended the funeral and observed the family carefully, noting how Thomas Fairchild seemed genuinely grief-stricken, how Margaret Rousseau appeared concerned but not surprised, how the enslaved people who served the meal worked with practice efficiency. He noticed Celia particularly, the way she moved through the house with quiet competence, the way she seemed to anticipate needs before they were expressed. He noticed that she made no eye contact with anyone, that her expression remained neutral regardless of what was happening around her. It was a demeanor common among enslaved people, a survival mechanism that made them invisible to the whites they served, but something about Celia nagged at Cartwright's medical instincts. He could not articulate what bothered him, could not point to any specific behavior that was suspicious. There was simply something in the way she existed in that space, something that suggested she was aware of things she was not supposed to know. After the funeral, Cartwright returned to New Orleans and added more notes to his journal. He wrote about the pattern of deaths, about the shared symptoms, about the sweet smell he had detected in William's bedroom, and now faintly noticed at William's funeral in the house where the body had been prepared. He wrote about Celia, though he did not name her, referring to her only as the cook who serves both households. Then he filed the journal away and tried to forget about the Fairchild family, because there was nothing he could do with his suspicions, nothing that would not create a scandal that could destroy his practice. In 1847, Louisiana, a physician who suggested that an enslaved woman might be systematically poisoning white families would be accused of inciting fear and rebellion, of giving dangerous ideas to people who were supposed to be kept ignorant and compliant. Cartwright's silence was the same silence that protected numerous injustices in the antebellum South, a wall of propriety and self-interest that made it easier to ignore uncomfortable truths than to confront them. He told himself he had no proof, which was technically accurate, but the deeper truth was that proof would have required him to see Celia as something other than property, as a person capable of sophisticated planning and execution, and that recognition would have undermined the entire social structure he lived within. Meanwhile, Celia continued her work. With William Fairchild dead, 2 of the 3 Fairchild estates were now without their primary masters. Thomas Fairchild took control of William's plantation, consolidating management while he searched for a buyer. This meant Celia was called upon more frequently to cook at both locations to prepare meals for potential buyers to maintain the appearance of normalcy while Thomas conducted business. She moved between the 2 estates with practiced ease, carrying death in her preserves and powders, her presence so ordinary that no one thought to question it. She attended to every detail of her work, making sure the food was excellent, the presentation perfect, the flavors exactly what the Fairchilds and their guests expected. In December of 1847, Thomas Fairchild announced his engagement to a widow from Natchez named Caroline H. Shricks. The wedding would take place in the spring of 1848, and Thomas asked Celia to begin planning an elaborate wedding feast for 100 guests. It would be the social event of the season in St. Martin Parish. An opportunity for Thomas to demonstrate that despite his recent losses, the Fairchild name still commanded respect and resources. Celia agreed to prepare the wedding feast, accepting the assignment with the same quiet competence she brought to every task. She began making lists of ingredients, planning courses, calculating quantities. She thought about how many people would eat her food at that wedding, how many of them were planters like the Fairchilds, how many of them participated in the same system of human commodification. She thought about Anna and Samuel, separated forever. She thought about Mary, her daughter, who would grow up enslaved unless something fundamental changed. She thought about the 400 souls working the Fairchild plantations and the thousands more working plantations throughout Louisiana, their lives measured in bushels of sugar and bales of cotton. And she thought about prick acid and oleander, about the ways different poisons worked in the human body, about dosages and timing, and the sweet smell that apparently lingered after death, though she had not known about that smell until she overheard Dr. Cartwright mentioning it to Dr. LeBlanc in a conversation she was not supposed to hear. The wedding feast would be her masterpiece. She decided it would be the culmination of 16 years of perfecting her craft, of learning to combine flavors in ways that delighted and satisfied. It would also be the moment when her true purpose would become impossible to ignore, when the pattern would finally be obvious even to people determined not to see it. But first, she needed to deal with Margaret Russo, the 3rd branch of the Fairchild Dynasty, the woman who managed her plantation with mathematical precision, and who had tried 3 times to purchase Celia outright because she recognized valuable property when she saw it. Margaret had invited Celia to her estate in January to prepare a dinner for the parish council, a gathering of the 12 men who controlled local government and who held significant economic power throughout St. Martin Parish. It was an opportunity Celia had been waiting for, a chance to address not just the Fairchild family, but the broader structure of power they represented. She began planning the menu for that dinner with the same care she brought to all her work, selecting recipes that would showcase her skills, that would leave the guests satisfied and impressed. She thought about proportions and timing, about which substances would work best for a large group, about how to ensure that every dish would carry exactly what she intended. As she worked preparing and testing recipes in the still room behind the main house, where Elizabeth Fairchild's collection of medicines and poisons remained largely untouched, Celia felt something she had not felt since she was a child. She felt like herself, Not Celia the cook, not Celia the slave, but Celia the person, the woman who made choices and accepted their consequences. If you are captivated by this story and wondering what happened next at Margaret Rousseau's dinner, show your support by hitting that like button. The events that unfolded at that parish council meeting would change the course of Louisiana history in ways no one could have predicted. Share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries, and let's continue this journey together. Drop a comment with your theories about what you think Celia did next. The January dinner at Margaret Rousseau's plantation would become the event that finally made the pattern impossible to ignore, that would force people like Dr. Cartwright to confront what they had been avoiding, that would begin the unraveling of Celia's carefully constructed plan. Margaret Fairchild Rousseau's estate, located north of Breaux Bridge along bayou teche, represented the third pillar of the Fairchild Empire. Unlike her cousins Thomas and William, Margaret had inherited her property through her father rather than building it herself, and she managed it with a precision that surprised and sometimes unsettled the men who did business with her. She kept detailed account books, personally inspected every aspect of her operation, and made decisions based on profit margins rather than tradition or sentiment. Her husband, Phipe Rousseau, had died in a riding accident in 1845, leaving Margaret a widow at 38 with no children. Rather than remarrying or selling the plantation, as many expected, she had taken full control of the operation and proceeded to run it more efficiently than Phipe ever had. She modernized equipment, negotiated better prices for her sugar, and reduced waste to levels that made other planters quietly envious. This efficiency extended to how she treated the 130 enslaved people who worked her land. Margaret was not cruel in the way William Fairchild had been, not given to random violence or theatrical displays of power. Instead, she was coldly practical. She calculated the minimum food necessary to keep people working, the optimal balance between punishment and productivity, the precise value of every human being she owned down to the dollar and cent. In some ways, this made her more dangerous than someone like William, whose cruelty was at least comprehensible as human weakness. Margaret's approach reduced people to numbers in her ledger, to assets that could be optimized like any other resource. She saw nothing wrong with this because she genuinely believed she was being rational, even humane, by avoiding unnecessary violence in favor of systematic efficiency. When Margaret invited Celia to prepare the parish council dinner in January of 1848, she specified exactly what she wanted, a meal impressive enough to demonstrate her hospitality and wealth, but not so extravagant as to seem wasteful. The parish council would be making decisions about road improvements and tax assessments, and Margaret wanted to ensure they remembered her cooperation and generosity. Celia arrived at the Rousseau plantation on January 14th, traveling with Daniel in the same wagon that had carried her to William's estate months earlier. The journey took a full day, the roads made difficult by recent rains that had turned them into channels of thick mud. They arrived in the late afternoon, and Celia immediately began surveying Margaret's kitchen and supplies. The Rousseau kitchen was well equipped but strictly organized, everything in its place, nothing wasted or excessive. Margaret's cook, an older woman named Hattie, who had worked on the estate for 40 years, showed Celia where ingredients were stored, which pots and pans to use, where the herbs and spices were kept. Hattie was friendly but cautious, aware that Margaret monitored the kitchen supplies carefully and would notice if anything was missing or misused. This presented Celia with a challenge she had not faced at Thomas or William's plantations. At the main Fairchild estate, she had access to Elizabeth's still room and could take what she needed without close oversight. At William's estate, the general disorganization had made it easy to work unnoticed. But Margaret's precision meant every item was accounted for, every ingredient tracked. Celia adapted by bringing her own supplies, telling Hattie that she preferred to use specific herbs and spices from the main Fairchild estate because she was familiar with their quality and freshness. This was plausible enough that Hattie accepted the explanation without question. Celia unpacked her basket in a corner of the kitchen, arranging small cloth bags and glass bottles on a shelf, all of them labeled with common ingredients. Black pepper, cinnamon, dried thyme, vanilla extract. The labels were accurate as far as they went. What they did not mention were the additional contents, the powders and tinctures Celia had carefully prepared and mixed into the labeled spices. She had learned over months of practice that disguising her additives within ordinary seasonings was safer than trying to add them separately to finished dishes. This way she could season food normally, her movements would look routine, and anyone watching would see exactly what they expected to see. The parish council dinner was scheduled for January 18th. Margaret had invited 12 council members and their wives, a gathering of 24 people who represented the political and economic power structure of St. Martin Parish. These were the men who decided which roads would be maintained, which neighborhoods would receive improvements, which complaints would be heard and which ignored. They were also, without exception, plantation owners or merchants who profited from the plantation economy. Celia spent 3 days preparing for the dinner, working alongside Hattie to create a meal that would meet Margaret's exacting standards. The menu included oyster soup, roasted duck with orange glaze, rice with mushrooms, green beans in butter sauce, fresh bread, and 3 different pies for dessert. Each course required hours of preparation, the duck alone needing to be cleaned, seasoned, and roasted for precise amounts of time to achieve the proper texture and flavor. As she worked, Celia paid attention to the conversations happening around her. Margaret met with the council members in her office during the days leading up to the dinner, discussing the agenda for the upcoming meeting. Celia, working in the kitchen, which was adjacent to the office, could hear fragments of these conversations through the thin walls. She heard them discuss a petition from Free People of Color in Breaux Bridge, requesting permission to establish a school. The council rejected it unanimously, with one member commenting that educated Negroes were a threat to social order. She heard them discuss a report of slave unrest on a neighboring plantation, agreeing to increase patrols and warning each other to watch for signs of discontent among their own workforce. She heard them discuss business casually, mentioning profits and losses, complaining about the cost of cotton, celebrating the high price of sugar. She heard them discuss human beings in the same tone they discussed livestock or equipment as things that could be bought or sold or worked harder if properly motivated. And she thought about the dinner she was preparing, about how carefully she had measured the additives in her spice jars, about how she had calculated dosages based on the number of guests expected. She thought about how these 24 people were not just individuals, but representatives of a system, nodes in a network of power that extended far beyond St. Martin Parish. On the evening of January 18th, Celia and Hattie served the meal in Margaret's dining room, a space that could comfortably seat 30 people at a table made from Louisiana cypress. The council members and their wives arrived dressed formally, the men in dark suits and the women in silk dresses that rustled when they moved. They greeted Margaret warmly, complimented the house, settled into their seats with the comfortable assurance of people accustomed to being served. Celia brought out course after course, each one prepared exactly as Margaret had specified. The oyster soup was rich and savory, the duck perfectly browned with crispy skin and tender meat, the rice fluffy and infused with the earthy flavor of wild mushrooms. The guests praised every dish, commenting on Celia's skill, suggesting that Margaret was fortunate to have access to Thomas Fairchild's cook. What they could not taste, what no one at that table could detect, was the additional ingredient that Celia had incorporated into multiple dishes. She had used a different substance than in her previous work, something she had extracted from water hemlock roots gathered along the bayou. Water hemlock was among the most poisonous plants in North America, containing a toxin called secutotoxin that affected the central nervous system rapidly and severely, but Celia had not used enough cytixin to cause immediate effects. Instead, she had calculated a dosage that would produce symptoms within 48 to 72 hours, delayed enough that no one would connect the illness to the dinner, especially since she had only added the substance to specific dishes that she controlled the preparation of entirely. This selectivity was crucial to her plan. She had not poisoned the bread, which Hattie had baked. she had not poisoned the pies which Margaret had ordered from a baker in Bow Bridge. She had added her preparations only to the duck, the rice, and the green beans, dishes she had prepared personally from start to finish. The dinner lasted 3 hours, with the guests lingering over coffee and brandy after the meal, discussing politics and business while Celia and Hattie cleared plates and washed dishes in the kitchen. Margaret was pleased with how the evening had gone, telling Celia before she left that Thomas should be proud of his cook's abilities. Celia returned to the main Fairchild plantation the next day, her basket lighter than when she had arrived, her expression unchanged. She resumed her normal duties, preparing meals for Thomas and his 2 sons, managing the household kitchen, going about her work with the same quiet efficiency that had characterized her 16 years of service. 3 days later, the first reports began to arrive from Bow Bridge. John DeVoe, one of the parish council members who had attended Margaret's dinner, had been found dead in his home on the morning of January 21st. His wife reported that he had been in good health at the dinner, but had begun experiencing violent tremors and convulsions the following evening. By the morning of the 21st, he was dead. Dr. LeBlanc was called to examine the body and found symptoms consistent with severe nervous disorder, muscle rigidity, evidence of seizures, facial contortion suggesting extreme pain. The death certificate listed the cause as apoplexy, a sudden death that physicians attributed to various causes ranging from stroke to heart failure, when they could not determine a specific diagnosis. By January 23rd, 2 more council members who had attended the dinner were experiencing similar symptoms. Alexander Thornton and his wife began suffering from tremors and confusion, along with a new symptom that had not appeared in the previous Fairchild deaths: severe gastrointestinal distress. Dr. Cartwright was summoned from New Orleans, and he immediately recognized a pattern. When Cartwright arrived in St. Martin Parish on January 25th, 4 people who had attended Margaret Russo's dinner were dead, and 7 more were experiencing symptoms ranging from mild tremors to full convulsions. This was no longer a mysterious fever that could be explained away as coincidence or hereditary weakness. This was an epidemic, or something that looked like an epidemic, concentrated entirely among people who had eaten a specific meal. Cartwright interviewed Margaret extensively, asking detailed questions about the dinner, the preparation, the sources of ingredients. Margaret provided her account books, showing exactly what had been purchased and from whom. Everything was in order, properly documented, nothing suspicious. Then Cartwright asked who had prepared the meal, and Margaret told him primarily Celia the cook from Thomas Fairchild's plantation, assisted by her own cookee. Cartwright felt something cold settle in his stomach. He asked if Celia had prepared meals at any other locations recently, and Margaret mentioned that Celia had also cooked at William Fairchild's estate in August shortly before William fell ill. Cartwright returned to his notes from his previous visits to the Fairchild plantations. He reviewed the timeline of deaths: Elizabeth Fairchild in July, William Fairchild in November, now 4 parish council members in January. He noted that Celia had been present at the Fairchild estate throughout Elizabeth's illness, had prepared a meal at William's plantation before his symptoms began, and had prepared the dinner that preceded the council members' deaths. The pattern was undeniable, but recognizing a pattern and proving deliberate poisoning were entirely different challenges, especially when the suspected poisoner was an enslaved woman whose very existence in the social order depended on her being seen as incapable of sophisticated planning or execution. Cartwright faced a dilemma. If he publicly accused Celia, he would need proof, not just circumstantial evidence based on her presence at multiple locations. Without proof, he would be starting a panic that could lead to violence against enslaved people throughout the parish. As white families became paranoid about their cooks and servants, the potential for a bloodbath was significant. But if he remained silent and his suspicions were correct, more people would die. The parish council members were already dead or dying. If Celia continued her work, who would be next? Thomas Fairchild himself, his sons, the guests at his upcoming wedding, Cartwright made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He wrote a detailed report of his findings, including his suspicions about Celia, and submitted it to the Louisiana Territory Medical Board in New Orleans. He recommended that the board conduct a formal investigation into the deaths, including chemical analysis of any preserved food or medicines from the affected households. The medical board received Cartwright's report in early February of 1848 and immediately filed it away without action. The reasons for this inaction were never officially documented, but they were not difficult to infer. An investigation into Celia would require acknowledging that an enslaved woman could carry out sophisticated murder across multiple locations over an extended period. It would require treating her as someone capable of complex reasoning, strategic planning, and sustained deception. Such an acknowledgement would undermine the fundamental premises of the slave system, which depended on portraying enslaved people as intellectually inferior, incapable of abstract thought, suitable only for manual labor under supervision. If Celia could systematically poison multiple households while avoiding detection for months, what did that say about the intelligence and capability of the hundreds of thousands of other enslaved people throughout the South? The implications were too dangerous to confront, so the medical board chose to attribute the deaths to a mysterious fever, possibly waterborne, possibly caused by contamination of a common food source, but definitely not the result of deliberate action by anyone, least of all an enslaved woman. This decision sealed the fates of everyone who would eat at Thomas Fairchild's wedding in April of 1848, an event that was rapidly approaching and that Celia was preparing for with meticulous attention to detail. Through February and March of 1848, the death toll from what was now being called the teche fever continued to rise. 7 of the 12 parish council members who had attended Margaret Russo's dinner eventually died. 5 others survived but suffered permanent neurological damage, including tremors, memory loss, and impaired speech. Their wives experienced similar but less severe symptoms, a pattern that puzzled physicians who expected disease to affect men and women equally. What the physicians did not understand, because they lacked the framework to consider it, was that Celia had carefully controlled which dishes received her additions. The duck and rice had been served to everyone, but she had prepared the green beans in 2 batches, one with butter sauce for the men, one with olive oil for the women, as was common at formal dinners of the period. Only the butter sauce batch had contained her preparations. This selectivity served multiple purposes. It varied the symptom severity between groups, making the illness seem like a disease with different manifestations rather than deliberate poisoning. It also meant that some people survived to tell conflicting stories about their symptoms, further muddying the diagnostic picture for physicians trying to understand what was happening. Dr. Cartwright, increasingly frustrated by the medical board's refusal to investigate, began his own quiet inquiry. He could not accuse Celia publicly without proof and without institutional support, but he could gather information. He traveled to the 3 Fairchild estates, interviewing enslaved people about their daily routines, asking subtle questions about Celia's movements and activities. What he learned disturbed him profoundly. Celia moved between the estates frequently, was trusted with access to locked rooms and storage areas, had extensive knowledge of herbs and medicines that she had learned from her mother and other older enslaved people. She was respected among the enslaved community, but also somewhat isolated, keeping to herself more than most, rarely engaging in the social interactions that provided relief from the brutality of plantation life. Several people mentioned that Celia had changed after Anna's death the previous May, becoming quieter and more withdrawn. One woman, speaking carefully, and only after Cartwright promised she would not be identified, said that Celia had told her that God had stopped listening to prayers from enslaved people, so they would have to find other ways to change their circumstances. Cartwright recognized the statement as potentially significant, but also as hearsay that would never be admissible as evidence in any legal proceeding. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that proving Celia's guilt, even if he could do so conclusively, would not solve the broader problem. The system that had created the circumstances leading to her actions would remain unchanged. The injustice would continue. This realization paralyzed Cartwright. He was a physician trained to diagnose and treat, but the disease he was confronting was not medical but social. Even if he exposed Celia, even if she was executed, as she almost certainly would be, what would change? Another enslaved person would take her place in the kitchen. Another family would own that person. The machinery of exploitation would continue operating exactly as it had before. Meanwhile, preparations for Thomas Fairchild's wedding proceeded. Despite the mysterious fever that had killed so many prominent citizens, Thomas saw no reason to postpone the ceremony. The deaths, tragic as they were, had occurred at Margaret's estate, not his. His household remained healthy. His sons showed no symptoms. Life continued. Caroline Riss, his bride-to-be, arrived from Natchez in mid-March with her personal belongings and 2 enslaved women who served as her maids. She was a practical woman, 35 years old, who had been widowed 3 years earlier when her first husband died of cholera. She brought a modest dowry and valuable social connections throughout Mississippi and Louisiana. The marriage was financially advantageous for both parties and personally suitable, though not romantic, in any conventional sense. Caroline took immediate interest in the household management, meeting with Celia to discuss the wedding feast and the ongoing needs of the estate. She was impressed by Celia's competence and organization, commenting to Thomas that he was fortunate to have such a capable cook. Thomas agreed, noting that Celia had been with the family for 16 years and was entirely trustworthy. The wedding was scheduled for April 23, 1848. Invitations had been sent to 100 guests throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. The ceremony would take place in the plantation's garden, followed by a feast in the main house that would showcase the Fairchild family's continued prominence despite recent tragedies. Celia began preparing for the wedding in early April, working 12 to 14 hours daily to create the elaborate meal Caroline and Thomas had requested. The menu included crawfish bisque, roasted venison with cranberry compost, ham glazed with honey and cloves, 3 types of vegetables, fresh bread, and a towering wedding cake that would require 3 days to construct properly. As she worked, Celia thought about numbers. 100 guests, most of them plantation owners or merchants connected to the plantation economy. Most of them people who participated in and profited from human bondage. She thought about how many enslaved people those 100 guests collectively owned, how many lives they controlled, how many families they had separated for profit. She thought about the dosages she would need, about how to distribute her preparations across multiple dishes to ensure maximum impact while avoiding immediate symptoms that would stop the feast and prevent full exposure. She thought about timing, about how long it would take for symptoms to develop, about whether she would still be alive when the truth finally became undeniable, because Celia knew with certainty that the wedding feast would be her final act. The scale of what she was planning could not be disguised as natural illness. When 100 people fell ill after eating a meal she had prepared, even the most willfully blind observers would have to acknowledge what had happened. She would be arrested, interrogated, and executed, probably tortured first to extract a confession that would satisfy the legal requirements. She accepted this outcome. She had accepted it months ago when she made her first addition to Elizabeth Fairchild's meal. Everything since then had been borrowed time, an extension of her life that she had used to inflict maximum damage on the system that had enslaved her. The only question that remained was whether she could complete her work before being stopped, whether she could serve that wedding feast and watch the Fairchilds and their guests consume what she had prepared. After that, her fate did not matter, but fate in the form of Dr. Benjamin Cartwright intervened in an unexpected way, On April 10th, 13 days before the wedding, Cartwright arrived at the Fairchild plantation unannounced. He asked to speak with Thomas privately, and the two men met in Thomas's study while Celia served them coffee. Cartwright waited until Celia left the room, then spoke bluntly. He told Thomas that he believed the mysterious fever was not a fever at all, but poisoning delivered deliberately through food. He explained his reasoning, the pattern of deaths, the common presence of celia at each location where illness occurred. He showed Thomas his medical notes, the timeline he had constructed, the probability calculations that made coincidence implausible. Thomas Fairchild listened to this explanation with growing horror, not because he immediately believed it, but because he understood the implications if it were true. If Celia had poisoned his wife, his brother, the parish council members, then she had done so while living in his household, serving his family, preparing every meal they ate. The violation was not just criminal but intimate, a betrayal of the trust that the entire social system depended upon. But Thomas was also a practical man, and he asked Cartwright the one question that mattered. Did he have proof? Cartwright admitted he did not in any legal sense. The evidence was circumstantial based on patterns and probability rather than physical evidence or confession. Moreover, Cartwright said the medical board had refused to investigate, and local authorities were unlikely to act on accusation alone, especially given the social complications involved. Thomas considered this information carefully. He could dismiss Cartwright's warning, continue with the wedding as planned, and hope the physician was wrong, or he could take precautions, even without proof, to protect his guests and his family. After a long silence, Thomas made a decision that likely saved dozens of lives. He told Cartwright he would postpone the wedding, citing concerns about the mysterious fever and the appropriateness of large gatherings during what appeared to be an epidemic. He would send Celia away from the estate not as punishment but as a precautionary measure, perhaps loaning her to Margaret Rousseau, whose household had been so devastated by illness that extra help was needed. Cartwright suggested a different approach. If Thomas wanted to know the truth, he said there was a way to test it. Keep Celia at the estate, but restrict her access to food preparation. Have other cooks prepare the family meals for 2 weeks. If everyone remained healthy, that would suggest Celia was not responsible. If suspicions persisted, Thomas could take further action. Thomas agreed to this plan. That evening, he informed Celia that he was temporarily reassigning her duties. She would assist with other household tasks, but would not prepare meals for the family. He explained that he wanted to give her a rest before the wedding preparations resumed, a plausible explanation that Celia accepted without visible reaction. But inwardly, Celia understood exactly what was happening. Someone, probably the physician from New Orleans, who had been asking questions, had connected her to the deaths. She had been discovered, or at least suspected, and her access to the one tool she had been using for 10 months had been cut off. She felt a curious mixture of disappointment and relief. Disappointment that she would not complete what she had started, that the wedding feast would not happen as planned, that the Fairchild dynasty would survive her efforts, but also relief that the constant vigilance required to maintain her deception was over, that she would no longer need to calculate dosages and watch for symptoms, and wonder if each meal would be her last before discovery. For 2 weeks, Celia performed other household duties while 2 cooks from a neighboring plantation prepared the Fairchild family meals. Thomas, his sons, and Caroline remained healthy. No tremors developed, no tongues darkened. The absence of symptoms was not proof of Celia's guilt, but it was certainly suggestive, and Thomas found himself watching Celia differently, seeing not the familiar cook who had served his family for 16 years, but a stranger whose thoughts and motivations he had never understood. Just when Thomas Fairchild thought he had avoided disaster, everything accelerated toward an ending that no one had predicted. If you have been gripped by this story and want to know what happened when the truth finally emerged, make sure you are subscribed and have notifications turned on. What unfolded in the final days of April 1008 148, would become one of the most controversial episodes in Louisiana history, a case that authorities tried desperately to suppress, but that eventually became impossible to hide. Hit that like button if this story has kept you on the edge of your seat. On April 20th, 3 days before the postponed wedding was supposed to have occurred, Margaret Fairchild Russo died in her sleep at her plantation near Breaux Bridge. She was 41 years old and had shown no symptoms of illness before retiring to bed the previous evening. Her cook, Hattie, found her the next morning and immediately sent for Dr. LeBlanc. LeBlanc examined the body and found the now familiar signs. Facial contortions suggesting pain, rigidity in the limbs, the faint sweet smell that seemed to accompany these mysterious deaths. He wrote another vague diagnosis on the death certificate, sudden apoplexy. But privately, he contacted Dr. Cartwright and told him that Margaret's death fit the pattern exactly. Cartwright traveled to the Russo plantation and conducted his own examination. Margaret had eaten dinner the previous evening with 2 neighbors who had come to discuss a business matter. Both neighbors were experiencing mild tremors and nausea, but nothing as severe as Margaret's fatal reaction. Cartwright questioned Hattie extensively about the meal preparation and learned something that made his blood run cold. Celia had visited the Russo plantation 3 days earlier on April 17th. She had brought preserves and baked goods from the Fairchild estate as a gift for Hattie, a kind gesture that seemed entirely normal. Hattie had served some of these preserves at dinner on April 19th, the night before Margaret died. Cartwright immediately went to the Fairchild plantation and confronted Thomas with this information. He told Thomas that Celia had found a way to continue her work despite being removed from kitchen duties, that she was distributing poisoned food through gifts and visiting other locations. Thomas needed to act immediately. Cartwright insisted before anyone else died. Thomas Fairchild called for his overseer and the parish constable. That afternoon, April 21st, 1848, Celia was arrested and confined to a locked storage building on the plantation while authorities decided how to proceed. She did not resist arrest. She did not protest her innocence. She simply allowed herself to be taken to confinement, her expression as neutral and unreadable as it had been throughout her years of service. The interrogation of Celia began on April 22nd in the locked building where she was being held. Present were Thomas Fairchild, Dr. Cartwright, the parish constable, and a magistrate from New Iberia named Judge Armand Tebito. Also present taking notes was a young lawyer named Charles Dupree, who would later become a district attorney and whose private papers would eventually reveal details of what happened in that room. Under Louisiana law in 1848, an enslaved person accused of a crime had no rights of due process, no right to representation, no protection against self-incrimination. The interrogation could proceed however the authorities chose, using whatever methods they deemed necessary to extract information. The purpose was not to determine guilt through a fair proceeding, but to extract a confession that would satisfy legal formalities before carrying out punishment. But something unexpected happened in that interrogation room. Celia, rather than denying the accusations or remaining silent or begging for mercy, did something that shocked everyone present. She confessed immediately and completely without any coercion whatsoever. She told them everything. She described how she had begun planning after Anna's death, how she had used Elizabeth Fairchild's still room to gather materials, how she had extracted poisons from cherry pits and oleander and water hemlock and other plants growing throughout the parish. She explained her methods of disguising the substances in food, of calculating dosages, of timing exposures to avoid immediate suspicion. She confirmed that she had poisoned Elizabeth Fairchild, William Fairchild, the parish council members at Margaret Russo's dinner, and finally Margaret herself. She estimated she had killed 23 people in total, though she acknowledged the exact number might be higher or lower, depending on whether some victims had survived longer than expected, or whether some deaths attributed to natural causes had actually been her doing. Judge Tebito interrupted her confession multiple times, disturbed by its calm, methodical tone. He asked her if she understood what she was admitting to, if she comprehended the consequences. Celia replied that she understood perfectly, and had understood for months that eventual discovery and execution were inevitable outcomes of her actions. Thomas Fairchild, listening to this woman he had known for 16 years reveal herself as someone entirely different from what he had imagined, finally asked the question that had been haunting him: why? Celia's answer was simple and devastating. She said that she had murdered his family and their associates because they had murdered hers first slowly over generations through a system of ownership that destroyed families, denied humanity, and justified itself through convenient lies about natural hierarchy and necessary order. She said that Anna's death had clarified something she had been trying not to see for 30 years. That appeals to morality or mercy or law would never change anything, because the people in power had no incentive to change a system that benefited them. So she had decided to remove some of those people to create consequences where none had existed before, to demonstrate that the power they held was not absolute. She said she had no illusions about changing the broader system through her actions. She knew 23 deaths would not end slavery,